The air in Teotihuacan, even before the sun climbed fully, thrummed with an unseen energy. It was not just the city's vastness, the way the Avenue of the Dead seemed to stretch into eternity. Flanked by pyramids that scraped the sky like the talons of colossal, sleeping beasts. It was something else, something that settled under the skin, a whisper of ancient power. Of cosmic alignments, and of blood. So much blood, spilled to keep the universe in motion. Ixbal, a young artisan known for his skill with obsidian, felt it every morning as he walked from his family's apartment compound towards the workshops near the citadel. He was 19, his frame lean from disciplined work, his hands calloused but nimble, his dark hair usually held back by a simple cotton band. A small, intricately carved jaguar tooth, a gift from his late grandfather, hung around his neck, a talisman against the city's more shadowy aspects. Today, however, the usual thrum was different. It was tighter, sharper, laced with an anxiety that mirrored the disquiet in his own heart. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent. Quetzalcoatl's formidable shrine at the heart of the citadel, was being prepared for a new dedication ceremony. And such ceremonies, in Teotihuacan, rarely passed without a significant offering to the gods. Ixbal's younger sister, Citlali, only 15, had been chosen as one of the ceremonial dancers. It was an honor, their parents had insisted, a mark of divine favor. But Ixbal had seen the dancers before, their youthful faces painted into emotionless masks, their bodies moving with a desperate, ecstatic grace that bordered on trance. And he had heard the whispers, the rumors of what sometimes happened to those who danced too close to the gods, whose vitality was deemed too potent to remain in the mortal realm. His stomach churned. Citlali was all light and laughter, her spirit as bright as the quetzal feathers she sometimes wove into her hair. The thought of her vibrant life extinguished to appease some insatiable deity, was a shard of obsidian twisting in his gut. He reached the workshop, the familiar sounds of chipping stone and grinding tools doing little to soothe his unease. His master, a stern but fair man named Yaxkin, was already inspecting a new shipment of raw obsidian. Nodules, their black volcanic glass gleaming like frozen night. The tribute from the southern mines is late, Ixbal, Yaxkin grunted, without looking up. And the priests of Quetzalcoatl demand new. Sacrificial knives, sharper than a serpent's tooth, brighter than Venus in the morning sky. For the dedication. Ixbal flinched inwardly at the mention of sacrificial knives. He had crafted many in his time, blades of such exquisite sharpness they could part flesh with a whisper. It was his trade, his skill, a source of pride. But today, the thought of those blades being used. Perhaps on warriors captured in recent skirmishes, or perhaps. He could not finish the thought. I will work swiftly, Master Yaxkin, Ixbal said, his voice carefully neutral. See that you do, Yaxkin replied, finally meeting his gaze. The older man's eyes, usually focused on the intricacies of stone, held a flicker of something, weariness. Or perhaps a shared, unspoken anxiety. The gods are hungry. And this city always feeds them. Ixbal picked up a large obsidian core, its weight familiar in his hands. He selected a deer antler, his pressure flaker, and began to work. With precise, controlled strikes, he sent razor-sharp blades flying from the core. Each flake was a perfect, lethal leaf of black glass. His hands moved with an inherited skill, a dancer's grace, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the shadowed plazas of the citadel. Where his sister would soon dance for a god who was both bird and serpent, creator and destroyer. He had to do something. But what could a mere artisan do against the combined power of the priests, the city's enigmatic rulers, and the very cosmic order they claimed to uphold? The city felt like a perfectly constructed trap, its wide avenues leading inexorably towards the sacrificial stone. And Citlali, his bright, beloved Citlali, was walking straight into its heart. The scar on his palm, A thin white line from a youthful accident with a poorly struck blade, ached. It always did when his fear was a living thing inside him. The days leading up to the dedication ceremony at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent were thick with a ritualistic fervor that permeated every corner of Teotihuacan. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation, with the scent of burning copal incense, and with an undercurrent of fear that no amount of ceremonial chanting could entirely disguise. Priests in elaborate feathered headdresses, their faces painted with symbols of cosmic power, moved through the city's avenues with an unnerving, focused intensity. Ixbel worked tirelessly on the sacrificial knives, his hands moving with a precision that belied the turmoil in his heart. Each blade he fashioned was a masterpiece of lethal elegance. Its edges sharper than any natural thong, its surface reflecting the workshop's dim light like a pool of captured darkness. Master Yaxkin watched him, his expression unreadable, offering occasional curt nods of approval but few words. The usual workshop banter was muted, replaced by a shared, unspoken apprehension. He saw Sitlali only briefly each evening. She was sequestered with the other chosen dancers, undergoing rigorous practice and purification rituals. When he did see her, her eyes, usually so bright and full of laughter, held a strange, distant luminosity. She spoke of dreams filled with soaring serpents and the rhythm of celestial drums. "It is a great honor, Ixbel," she would say. Her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. "I will dance for Quetzalcoatl, for the renewal of the world." Ixbel wanted to scream, to shake her, to tell her of the whispers he would heard, that sometimes the most vibrant dancers, those whose life force burned brightest, were chosen for an even greater honor after the ceremony. Their hearts, it was said, were offered directly to the god, their blood anointing the temple's serpent heads. Ensuring the sun would rise, the rains would fall, the cosmic cycles would continue. But he could not. To voice such fears would be to invite disaster, to question the will of the gods and the authority of the priests. In Teotihuacan, such dissent was not tolerated. His desperation grew with each passing day. He sought out his old friend, Tlacanol, a potter who lived in a neighboring compound. Tlacanol was older, more cynical. With a network of contacts that reached into many of Teotihuacan's hidden corners. "They say this dedication is special," Ixbel said, his voice low, as they shared a gourd of fermented pulque in the relative privacy of Tlacanol's workshop, the air thick with the smell of damp clay. "That the offerings will be significant." Tlacanol took a long drink, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "The gods are always hungry, Ixbel. And Quetzalcoatl, for all his feathers, has a serpent's appetite." He looked at his friend, his eyes shrewd. "It is Sitlali you fear for, is not it?" Ixbel nodded, the admission a painful lump in his throat. "She is so young, Tlacanol. So full of life. It feels wrong. A waste." "Wrong is a word the priests do not understand," Tlacanol said grimly. "They understand necessary. They understand power. And they understand fear." He paused. "I have heard things. The rulers of the city. They feel a shift in the cosmic winds. Perhaps the rains were not as plentiful last season. Perhaps a distant tributary state grows restless. When such things happen, the gods demand a stronger appeasement." "Is there nothing that can be done?" Ixbel asked, his voice raw. Tlacanol sighed, the sound like air escaping a cracked pot. "What can be done against the will of a god, Ixbel, or rather, against those who interpret that will for their own ends?" He looked around his workshop, at the rows of utilitarian pots and the few, more finely crafted ceremonial vessels. "We make things. We live. We die. We try to leave as little for the priests to take as possible. That is our lot." But Ixbel could not accept it. His love for Sitlali was a fierce, protective fire. He thought of her small hands, her quick smile, the way she would hum tunes while helping their mother grind maize. To imagine that vibrant spirit extinguished. He began to observe the priests more closely, their routines, their movements around the citadel. He noted the guards, their numbers, their vigilance. A wild, improbable idea began to take shape in his mind. A plan so audacious, so dangerous, it made his blood run cold. But the alternative, to do nothing, to watch his sister dance towards a potential doom, was even more terrifying. His skill with Obsidian, his ability to craft tools of exquisite sharpness, had always been a source of pride. Now, he began to think of that skill not as a means of creation, but as a means of intervention. The thought was blasphemous. Terrifying. But Sitlali's face, her bright, innocent eyes, haunted his waking hours and his troubled dreams. The city demanded sacrifice. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to offer a different kind. The final night before the dedication ceremony descended upon Teotihuacan like a shroud. The city hummed with a nervous, suppressed energy. Torches flickered along the avenue of the dead, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe like the stone serpents adorning Quetzalcoatl's temple. The air was thick with the scent of copal and dread. Ixbal could not sleep. His mind raced, replaying the desperate plan he had formulated. It was a fool's gambit, a moth flying towards a flame, but it was the only thing he could conceive. He had spent the last few days subtly observing the routines around the chamber where the sacred regalia for the priests and the sacrificial victims were kept, a heavily guarded annex near the temple of the feathered serpent. He had noted the changing of the guards, the moments of lesser vigilance, the narrow service passages used by acolytes. His idea was simple in its audacity, terrifying in its implications. He would attempt to steal or deface one of the primary sacrificial implements, perhaps the great obsidian knife reserved for the high priest. Or the ceremonial basin meant to catch the sacred blood. If a key element of the ritual was missing or rendered impure, it might delay the proceedings, cause confusion. Perhaps even be interpreted as an ill omen by the priests themselves. It was a sliver of a chance, a desperate hope that a disruption in the meticulously planned ceremony might somehow spare Sitlali, or at least buy time for some other unforeseen intervention. He rose from his sleeping mat, his movements as silent as a hunting cat. His parents and Sitlali were already at the citadel, part of the pre-dawn preparations. He slipped out of their compound, the jaguar tooth around his neck feeling strangely heavy. He carried nothing but a small, razor-sharp obsidian blade he had fashioned himself, hidden in the fold of his loincloth, and a heart pounding like a war drum. The city was eerily quiet, yet alive with unseen watchers. He kept to the shadows, his knowledge of Teotihuacan's labyrinthine back alleys and service corridors serving him well. The citadel loomed larger with every step, its monumental architecture a testament to the city's power and its god's insatiable demands. The snarling stone heads of the feathered serpent seemed to follow his progress, their obsidian inlaid eyes glinting in the torchlight. He reached the heavily guarded annex. As he had observed, there was a brief period of laxity during the pre-dawn shift change. He slipped past a dozing guard, his breath held tight in his chest, and found himself in a narrow corridor, the air thick with the smell of incense and something else. Something metallic and unsettling. He located the chamber he sought. The door was heavy, but not locked. He pushed it open a fraction, peering inside. By the light of a single flickering torch, he saw them, the sacred implements, laid out on a stone altar. The great sacrificial knife, its obsidian blade a foot long, polished to a terrifying sheen. Golden cups. Jade ornaments. And ropes, thick and ominous. His hand went to the small blade hidden in his loincloth. This was it. He had to be quick. But as he was about to step into the chamber, a sound from further down the corridor made him freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Not the shuffling of an acolyte, but the measured tread of a priest or a high-ranking guard. Panic seized him. He had miscalculated. He was trapped. He scanned the corridor desperately. There was nowhere to hide. The footsteps were getting closer. He could hear guttural chanting now, low and ominous. Then, he saw it, a small, recessed alcove, partially hidden by a hanging tapestry depicting Quetzalcoatl in his plumed glory. It was barely large enough for him to squeeze into. He flattened himself against the cold stone, pulling the tapestry slightly to conceal himself, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the chamber he had been about to enter. He heard the scrape of the heavy door opening. Through a tiny gap in the tapestry's weave, he saw a high priest, his face painted in terrifying symbols, his headdress a cascade of iridescent Quetzal feathers, enter the sacred chamber. The priest began to chant, his voice rising in a hypnotic cadence, as he inspected the ritual implements. Ixbel remained frozen, every muscle screaming. The priest was so close. If he were discovered now. The priest spent what felt like an eternity in the chamber, his chanting filling the air. Then, just as Ixbel thought he might collapse from the strain, the priest emerged. His face serene, seemingly satisfied that all was in order. He closed the heavy door and continued down the corridor, his footsteps receding into the darkness. Ixbel waited, his body trembling, until he was sure the priest was gone. His chance had passed. The implements were secure, soon to be used. His desperate plan had failed. A cold despair washed over him. He had risked everything and achieved nothing. Citlali. Defeated, Ixbel slipped away from the citadel as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the tops of the pyramids. The city was awakening, the sounds of drums and conch shell trumpets echoing. From the ceremonial district, heralding the start of the great dedication. He felt a hollowness inside, a bitter taste of failure. He had been a fool to think he could defy the gods, or the men who served them. He made his way to the great plaza, already filling with a hushed, expectant crowd. He had to see Citlali, even if it was for the last time. He found his parents near the edge of the plaza. Their faces pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the temple of the feathered serpent, which loomed over them, its stone serpent seeming to writhe in the growing light. The ceremony began with a procession of priests, their chants rising in a hypnotic wave. Then came the warriors, captured in recent battles, their hands bound, their expressions stoic or resigned. They were the first offerings, their strong hearts deemed necessary to invigorate the temple. Ixbel watched, a cold dread gripping him, as they were led up the steep temple stairs. He heard the distant shouts, the thud of the obsidian knife, the roar of the crowd as the priests held aloft the still beating hearts. A gruesome tribute to the voracious gods. Then, the dancers emerged. A troupe of young men and women, their bodies painted, their movements fluid and ecstatic. And among them, Citlali. She was transformed. Her face was a mask of divine rapture, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on some distant, inner vision. She wore a headdress of Quetzal feathers that shimmered with every movement, her slender form adorned with jade and shells that rattled in time with the pounding drums. She danced with a furious, breathtaking energy, a living flame offered to the gods. Ixbel watched, his heart aching. She was beautiful, terrifyingly beautiful. And so very alive. He saw his mother weep silently, his father's face a stoic mask hiding a breaking heart. The dance reached a crescendo. The music swelled, the drums pounded like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The priests watched, their expressions intense, searching for the one whose spirit burned brightest, whose life force was most potent. Ixbal's gaze was fixed on Sitlali. She seemed to be channeling the very essence of Quetzalcoatl, her movements both serpentine and bird-like. She spun, she leaped, a whirlwind of color and energy. And then, as the music reached its peak, she stumbled. Just for a moment. A tiny, almost imperceptible falter. But Ixbal saw it. And he saw the high priest's eyes narrow, his gaze fixing on her. A cold premonition washed over Ixbal. That stumble, that brief flicker of human frailty amidst divine ecstasy, had marked her. The dance ended. The dancers collapsed, panting, their bodies slick with sweat. The high priest stepped forward, his voice booming across the plaza. He spoke of the glory of Quetzalcoatl. Of the sacred duty of sacrifice, of the renewal of the cosmos. Then, he raised his hand and pointed. Toward Sitlali. This one, he declared. Her spirit has touched the god. Her life force will nourish the feathered serpent. She is chosen. A gasp went through the crowd. Ixbal felt the world tilt. His mother let out a choked sob. Sitlali, still dazed, looked up, her eyes slowly focusing, a dawning awareness. A flicker of fear, finally breaking through her trance. Two temple guards stepped forward, their obsidian-edged spears glinting. They moved toward Sitlali. Ixbal could not breathe. This was it. The moment he had dreaded. His failure in the annex now seemed a cosmic cruelty. He had tried, and he had failed. But as the guards reached for Sitlali, something unexpected happened. A commotion at the edge of the plaza. Shouts. Confusion. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Master Yaxkin, Ixbal's obsidian instructor, was pushing his way forward, his face grim, his voice raised in uncharacteristic agitation. He was carrying something wrapped in a rough cotton cloth. A moment, High Priest, Yaxkin called out, his voice surprisingly strong. An offering, a different kind of offering. The High Priest, his ritual interrupted, looked down with cold annoyance. What is the meaning of this, artisan? Do you dare disrupt the sacred rites? Yaxkin reached the foot of the temple stairs. He knelt, then unwrapped the cloth. Lying on it was not a human heart, not a captive warrior, but a magnificent obsidian sculpture. A coiled feathered serpent, its scales intricately carved, its eyes inlaid with polished jade, its fangs bared in a silent, powerful snarl. It was a masterpiece, far exceeding anything Ixbal had ever seen Yaxkin create. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a perfect, frozen embodiment of the god. This, High Priest, Yaxkin said, his voice trembling slightly but firm, is my life's work. Crafted over many seasons, in secret, as my own devotion to the great Quetzalcoatl. I offer it now, in place of another offering. A thing of beauty, of enduring skill, to honor the god. Is not such a gift, born of a lifetime of dedication, also worthy? A stunned silence fell over the plaza. The high priest stared down at the obsidian serpent, his expression unreadable. The crowd murmured, a confused, expectant hum. The temple guards, who had been about to seize Sitlali, hesitated, looking to the priest for guidance. Sitlali herself, pale and trembling, watched with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Ixbal felt a surge of disbelief, then a wild, desperate hope. What was Yaxkin doing? This was an unprecedented act, a direct challenge to the established ritual, however couched in terms of devotion. The high priest slowly descended a few steps, his gaze fixed on the obsidian masterpiece. He was a man of rigid tradition, a guardian of ancient rites. Human sacrifice was the lifeblood of their cosmology, the ultimate offering. Yet, Yaxkin's offering was undeniably extraordinary. The skill, the artistry, the sheer devotion evident in every perfectly carved scale and polished curve, was breathtaking. It was, in its own way, a profound act of reverence. And perhaps, there was a political consideration. Yakskin was a respected master artisan, head of a vital workshop that supplied the temple with its tools and ceremonial objects. To summarily reject such a unique and public offering, to punish him for this act of unorthodox piety, could send ripples of unease through the city's artisan guilds. A powerful and essential segment of Teotihuacan's populace. The high priest finally spoke, his voice resonating across the silent plaza. The artisan Yakskin speaks with a bold tongue. He offers a gift of stone, a work of mortal hands, in place of the vibrant life force the gods demand. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Yet, he continued, his gaze still on the obsidian serpent, Quetzalcoatl is a god of creation as well as destruction. Of beauty as well as blood. He is the patron of artisans, the giver of skills. He looked at Yakskin. Your offering, artisan, is indeed remarkable. It speaks of a lifetime's devotion. Such dedication has its own power. He then looked up, towards the snarling stone heads, adorning the temple. The feathered serpent sees all offerings. He weighs all hearts, all intentions. Another long silence. Then, the high priest made his pronouncement. The obsidian serpent shall be accepted. It will be placed within the sacred chamber, a testament to the skill Quetzalcoatl bestows upon his devoted children. He raised his voice. Let the cosmos know that Teotihuacan honors its gods not only with the fleeting breath of life, but with the enduring beauty of inspired creation. A collective sigh, a murmur of astonishment and relief, swept through the crowd. Ixpel felt his knees go weak. Yakskin had done it. He had offered a different kind of sacrifice, and the priest, for whatever complex reasons, divine inspiration, political pragmatism, or perhaps even a genuine appreciation for the art, had accepted it. The high priest then turned his attention back to the dancers. His gaze passed over Sitlali, lingering for a moment, then moved on. He selected another young dancer. A strong youth who had shown exceptional fervor, to be honored with a special role in the continuing rites, a role that, while significant, did not involve the ultimate sacrifice. Sitlali was led away by other temple attendants, not towards the sacrificial stone, but back towards the dancer's precinct, to be cleansed and released. Ixpel saw her look back. Her eyes finding his in the crowd. There was confusion in her gaze, and exhaustion, but also a dawning, fragile relief. As the ceremony resumed, albeit with a subtly altered energy, Ixpel made his way to Yakskin, who was still kneeling at the foot of the temple, his head bowed, the space where the obsidian serpent had lain now starkly empty. Master Yakskin, Ixpel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. What you did? How did you? Yakskin looked up, his face old and tired, but with a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. Sometimes, Ixpel, he said quietly, the finest blade is not the one that takes a life, but the one that creates something worthy of preserving it. He rose slowly to his feet. The gods have many hungers. Perhaps, just perhaps, they can sometimes be persuaded to feast on beauty instead of blood. He placed a hand on Ixpel's shoulder. You have skill, boy. Great skill. Use it wisely. Create things that honor life, not just those that serve death. He then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Ixpel to ponder the astonishing events of the day, and the profound courage of a master artisan, who had dared to offer a different kind of heart to the gods of Teotihuacan. The city, for a day, had chosen art over blood. It was a small shift, perhaps a temporary one, in the grand, relentless cosmic machinery, but for Ixpel, and for Sitlali, it was everything. The shadow of the feathered serpent still loomed, but for now, its hunger had been, in a small way, appeased by the enduring power of a craftsman's devoted hands. In the days that followed the momentous dedication ceremony, a subtle but palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of Teotihuacan. The acceptance of Yaxkin's obsidian serpent as a worthy offering had sent ripples through the city. Among the artisan guilds, there was a newfound sense of pride, a quiet validation of their skills not just as tools for the state or the priesthood, but as expressions of devotion in their own right. The priests, while maintaining their solemn authority, seemed a fraction less unyielding, perhaps contemplating the implications of the high priest's unprecedented decision. Sitlali returned to their family compound. Pale and subdued, the divine ecstasy of the dance replaced by a profound exhaustion and a lingering, haunted look in her eyes. She spoke little of her experience, but clung to Ixpel with a fierce, unspoken gratitude. The terror of having been chosen, then unexpectedly spared, had left its mark. It took many days for her laughter to return. And when it did, it was softer, more thoughtful than before. Ixpel continued his work in Yaxkin's workshop, but his perspective had changed. The sacrificial knives he still had to craft felt heavier in his hands, the purpose behind them more starkly apparent. He poured more of his energy into creating other objects, intricately carved ear spools, ceremonial plaques, small animal effigies, pieces that celebrated life and beauty, rather than serving death. Yaxkin observed this shift with quiet approval, offering guidance and pushing Ixpel to explore the full range of his talent. The blade that takes a life must be perfect, it is true, Yaxkin told him one afternoon, as they inspected a newly finished sunstone disc Ixpel had inlaid with intricate obsidian patterns. But the carving that captures a spirit, that brings joy or solace to the beholder, that requires a different kind of perfection, Ixpel. A perfection of the heart. News of Yaxkin's offering, and the high priest's acceptance, spread beyond Teotihuacan. Traders carried the story to distant city-states, embellishing it along the way. Some said the obsidian serpent had come to life, whispering prophecies to the high priest. Others claimed it was a sign that Quetzalcoatl himself favored art over blood. These exaggerated tales, while far from the truth, nevertheless contributed to Teotihuacan's mystique, painting it not just as a city of power and sacrifice, but also as a center of unparalleled artistic genius. However, the cosmic balance, as understood by the priests of Teotihuacan, was a delicate and ever-shifting thing. The respite gained by Yaxkin's offering was not to last indefinitely. A prolonged drought a few seasons later, coupled with unrest in a peripheral province, once again darkened the mood in the city. The priests spoke with renewed urgency of the god's displeasure, of the need for more potent offerings to restore harmony. The shadow of sacrifice loomed once more. This time, the demand was for warriors, for strong hearts to replenish the flagging energies of the cosmos. Ixpel watched with a familiar dread as raiding parties were dispatched, as captives were brought back to the city in chains. The cycle seemed unbreakable. Yet, something had changed within him, and perhaps, within a small segment of the city. Yaxkin's act had planted a seed, a possibility that devotion could take many forms. Ixpel found himself discussing these ideas. Cautiously at first, with Tlacanol, the potter. One beautiful serpent does not change the god's entire appetite, Ixpel, Tlacanol said, his usual cynicism tinged with a reluctant admiration for Yaxkin. But perhaps it showed that other dishes can be offered. The priests, they are powerful, but they also listen to the pulse of the city, to the strength of its spirit. If the spirit of creation is strong. He shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. Inspired, Ixpel began a new project in secret, working late into the night after his official duties in Yaxkin's workshop were done. He chose the largest, most flawless piece of obsidian he could find. He was not attempting to replicate Yaxkin's serpent. His vision was different. He envisioned the scene of creation, of Quetzalcoatl not as a demanding deity, but as a bestower of gifts, maize, knowledge, the arts. It was an audacious concept. One that challenged the dominant narrative of the gods' hunger. His hands, guided by a fierce determination and a burgeoning artistic vision, worked with a feverish intensity. He poured all his skill, all his hope, all his quiet defiance into the piece. It was a prayer in stone, an argument carved in obsidian. As another great ceremony approached, one demanding significant offerings, Ixbel knew he might not have Yaxkin standing or the unique circumstances that had led to the acceptance of the obsidian serpent. But he felt compelled to try. His art was his only weapon, his only voice against the relentless drumbeat of sacrifice. The city held its breath. The Avenue of the Dead was once again prepared for processions, the temple plaza for sacred rites. Citlali, now older, no longer a dancer but an assistant to the temple weavers, watched Ixbel with a mixture of fear and pride, understanding the silent battle he was waging. This time, the offerings were to be many. The priests' faces were grim, their chants heavy with foreboding. The fate of Teotihuacan, they proclaimed, hung in the balance. The atmosphere in Teotihuacan on the eve of this new grand ceremony was even more oppressive than before. The drought had left its mark. The city's reservoirs were low. And the surrounding fields, usually vibrant with maize, were parched and dusty. Whispers of unease, of fear for the future, were more audible now, less easily silenced by the priests' pronouncements. The gods, it was widely believed, were deeply displeased. Ixbel worked on his obsidian carving with a desperate urgency, the image of Quetzalcoatl as a benevolent creator slowly emerging from the black volcanic glass. It was a vision of hope. A stark contrast to the prevailing mood of fear and appeasement. He knew the risks. To present such an image, one that subtly challenged the priest's narrative of a bloodthirsty deity, was an act of profound defiance. Yaxkin, now frail with age but his eyes still sharp, watched Ixbel's progress with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "You carve a dangerous truth, my boy," he said one evening. His voice a low rasp. "Beauty can be a shield, but it can also be a target." He placed a trembling hand on Ixbel's shoulder. "Whatever happens, know that your skill has surpassed my own. You see with a clarity that few possess." On the morning of the ceremony, Ixbel, his heart a cold stone in his chest, wrapped his finished carving in a clean cotton cloth. It depicted Quetzalcoatl not with bared fangs, but with hands outstretched, offering ears of maize and a scroll of wisdom to a kneeling human figure. Intricate feather patterns flowed around the god, suggesting flight and gentle breezes rather than predatory strikes. It was, Ixbel hoped, an offering of a different vision, a plea for a different kind of relationship with the divine. He made his way to the citadel, joining the throng of citizens moving towards the great plaza. The air was thick with the scent of copal and the low thrum of ceremonial drums. This time, there were no ceremonial dancers like Citlali had been. The mood was too grim. The offerings were to be stern and unequivocal, captive warriors, their hearts torn out to replenish the sun, their blood to soak the parched earth and implore the rain gods. As the procession of priests and bound captives began its slow march up the Avenue of the Dead towards the Pyramid of the Sun, the chosen site for this particularly potent ritual, Ixbel felt a knot of despair tighten within him. How could his small carving, his silent plea, possibly stand against such an overwhelming display of ancient, brutal tradition? He saw Citlali in the crowd, her face pale, her eyes searching for him. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, a gesture that spoke volumes of her faith in him. A faith he was not sure he deserved. The high priest, the same one who had presided over Yaxkin's offering, ascended the pyramid's steep steps, his feathered headdress a stark silhouette against the harsh blue sky. His voice, amplified by the pyramid's acoustics, boomed across the plaza, speaking of cosmic imbalance, of the god's anger, of the sacred duty of blood sacrifice to restore order and bring forth the life-giving rains. The first captive was dragged towards the sacrificial stone. A hush fell over the massive crowd. This was the moment. If Ixbel was to act, it had to be now. With a courage he did not know he possessed, he pushed his way through the onlookers, towards the base of the pyramid. He ignored the surprised shouts, the angry glares. He reached the clear space at the foot of the great monument. Directly in the sightline of the high priest. "A moment, high priest," Ixbel called out, his voice surprisingly steady, echoing Yaxkin's words from seasons past. An offering of enduring devotion to the great Quetzalcoatl, bringer of life." He knelt, as Yaxkin had done, and unwrapped his carving. He held it aloft, the polished obsidian gleaming in the harsh sunlight, the image of the benevolent, gift-giving God clear for all to see. A wave of murmurs, of shock and disbelief, swept through the crowd. The high priest, his hand poised to signal the start of the sacrifice, froze. His eyes, like chips of flint, narrowed as he stared down at Ixbel and his audacious offering. The priests flanking him stirred, their expressions a mixture of outrage and surprise. The guards tensed, their spears ready. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Ixbel remained kneeling, his arms aching from holding the heavy carving, his gaze fixed on the high priest. He had made his plea. He had offered his vision. The rest was in the hands of the gods, or the men who claimed to speak for them. He thought of Citlali, of Yaxkin, of the small, persistent hope that beauty and creation could, just sometimes, outweigh the demand for destruction. The sun beat down. And the fate of Teotihuacan, and of one young artisan, hung suspended in that single, breathless moment. The high priest's face was an inscrutable mask. For what felt like an eternity, he simply stared down at Ixbel and the obsidian carving. The plaza was so silent that Ixbel could hear the frantic beating of his own heart, the rustle of the priest's feathered headdress in the slight breeze. The captive warrior on the sacrificial stone, who had been moments from death, watched with a dazed, uncomprehending hope. Then, the high priest spoke, his voice cold and measured. "Twice now, an artisan has dared to interrupt the sacred rites with offerings of stone. The first was a serpent of power, a reflection of the god's formidable aspect. This is different." He gestured towards Ixbel's carving. "This is a vision of gentleness. Of bounty. A god who gives, rather than demands." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the anxious crowd, then returning to Ixbel. "Do you presume to instruct the gods on their own nature, artisan? Do you believe your pretty carving can appease a cosmic imbalance that demands the strong blood of warriors?" Ixbel, still kneeling, found his voice, though it trembled. "Honored high priest, I presume nothing. I only offer what my hands and heart have made, in deepest reverence. Our city thirsts. Our fields are barren. We pray for life, for renewal. This carving. It is a prayer for Quetzalcoatl's life-giving aspect to prevail, for the rains to return. For the maize to grow. It is an offering of hope, that the cycle of creation may be as potent as the cycle of sacrifice." His words, simple but heartfelt, seemed to hang in the air. Some in the crowd murmured their assent. The desire for rain, for an end to the drought, was a desperate, universal yearning. Others looked fearful, shocked by Ixbel's audacity. The high priest considered this. The city was suffering. The usual sacrifices, though performed with all due diligence, had not yet broken the drought. Perhaps a different kind of appeal was needed, or perhaps this young artisan's offering, so publicly made, so resonant with the people's desperate hope, could be turned to the priesthood's advantage, a demonstration of their willingness to explore all avenues of divine communication. He looked again at Ixbal's carving, at the image of Quetzalcoatl offering maize. It was undeniably beautiful, imbued with a spirit that was both powerful and serene. "The ways of the gods are mysterious," the high priest finally declared, his voice losing some of its earlier iciness. "They speak to us in many forms, in the thunder and the gentle rain, in the serpent strike and the Quetzal's flight." He looked towards the sky, as if seeking guidance. Perhaps the great feathered serpent, in this time of need, desires to be reminded not only of our fear, but also of our hope. Not only of our willingness to give life, but also of our deep yearning for its sustenance. He made a decision. "This offering, too, shall be accepted," he proclaimed, his voice now carrying a new resonance. "It shall be placed beside the obsidian serpent of power, in the temple's heart. Let them stand together, the God who demands, and the God who provides. Let our prayers encompass all aspects of the divine." He then addressed Ixbal. "Your courage, artisan, is as sharp as your obsidian. Your vision is noted." He turned to the captive warrior on the stone. "And you, warrior, today Quetzalcoatl has chosen a different kind of sustenance. You shall be spared. You will labor for the temple, your life a testament to the god's unpredictable mercy." A wave of astonishment, then a rising cheer, swept through the plaza. It was a sound Teotihuacan had not heard in many seasons, not the ritualistic roar of sacrifice, but a genuine outpouring of relief and hope. Citlali was openly weeping, her hand clasped over her mouth. Yaxkin, standing near the edge of the crowd, nodded slowly, a look of profound pride on his weathered face. Ixbal felt a lightness, a release so profound it almost unseated him. He had done it. He had offered his prayer, and it had been heard. The ceremony continued, but its tone had irrevocably shifted. While other, lesser offerings were still made, the main blood sacrifice had been averted. Ixbal's carving of the benevolent Quetzalcoatl was carried with great reverence up the pyramid steps and placed in a prominent position within the temple, a counterpoint to Yaxkin's formidable serpent. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The skies, long a brassy, unforgiving blue, began to cloud over. And then, one evening, the rains came. Not a furious deluge, but a soft, steady, life-giving rain that soaked into the parched earth, that filled the city's reservoirs, that promised a renewal of the maize fields. Coincidence, divine intervention, the priests proclaimed it a sign that their prayers, in all their forms, had been answered. The people of Teotihuacan, weary of drought and fear, chose to believe. Ixbal's offering, and the story surrounding it, became a legend, whispered in the marketplaces and apartment compounds. The artisan who had carved hope from obsidian, who had helped bring forth the rain. The rains transformed Teotihuacan. The Avenue of the Dead, once dusty and stark, saw new greenery sprout in the crevices of its ancient stones. The scent of damp earth and blooming desert flowers replaced the acrid smell of fear and prolonged drought. The maize, replanted with hopeful hands, began to push through the softened soil. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the city, a loosening of the tension that had gripped it for so long. Ixbal became a figure of quiet renown. He was no longer just a skilled artisan. He was Ixbal of the Rains, or he who carved hope. People would approach him in the marketplace, not with demands or fear, but with a kind of gentle respect, sometimes offering a small gift, a piece of fruit, a handful of fresh beans. He always accepted with humble gratitude, knowing that their reverence was less for him and more for the miracle they believed he had helped bring about. Master Yaxkin, his health failing but his spirit bright, took great pride in his former apprentice. "You see, Ixbal," he rasped one day, his hand on Ixbal's arm, "the heart of this city It yearns for creation, not just appeasement. You gave it a voice. Not long after, Yaxkin passed peacefully, his legacy secured not only in his own magnificent obsidian serpent, but in the student who had dared to dream even further. Sitlali, her earlier trauma now softened by the city's renewal, found a new purpose. Inspired by Ixbal's courage and the power of art to effect change, she began to incorporate more intricate narrative designs into her weaving, telling stories of hope, of community, of the beauty of the natural world. Her textiles became highly sought after. Not just for their skill, but for the spirit they embodied. Pentu, the scribe who had once subtly guided Ixbal, was now a high-ranking official in the city's administration, though his heart remained that of an artist and a scholar. He would sometimes seek Ixbal out, not for official commissions, but to discuss ideas, to look at Ixbal's latest creations, to share a quiet moment of contemplation on the city's ever-shifting spiritual landscape. You have shown us, Ixbal, Pentu once remarked, that even the oldest traditions can find new expressions. That the gods, perhaps, are more multifaceted than our rigid rituals sometimes allow. The dual offerings, Yaxkin's powerful serpent and Ixbal's benevolent, gift-giving Quetzalcoatl, became central icons within the temple of the feathered serpent. Pilgrims and visitors would gaze upon them, marveling at their contrasting beauty, pondering their deeper meanings. The priests, adapting to the new narrative, began to speak more of Quetzalcoatl's dual nature, his capacity for both stern judgment and life-affirming grace. The theology of Teotihuacan, while still rooted in ancient traditions, had subtly expanded, making room for a more hopeful, less blood-centric vision. This did not mean an end to all sacrifice. Teotihuacan was still a city that believed in the necessity of offerings to maintain cosmic order. But the nature and frequency of the grand, city-wide human sacrifices seemed to lessen, at least for a time. More emphasis was placed on offerings of art, of precious materials, of agricultural bounty, and on smaller, more symbolic rituals. The fear that had once been a constant undercurrent in the city's life began to recede, replaced by a more resilient, creative spirit. Ixbal himself continued to carve, his workshop becoming a place of pilgrimage for younger artisans seeking inspiration. He never sought power or official position. His influence was quieter, expressed through the beauty and integrity of his work. He taught his apprentices not just the techniques of obsidian carving, but the importance of infusing their creations with heart, with meaning, with a connection to the life force that flowed through the city and the cosmos. Years passed. Teotihuacan faced new challenges, political intrigues, shifts in trade routes, the occasional tremor of the earth. But the memory of the drought, and the way it had been broken, not solely by blood but by an offering of hope and beauty, endured. It became a cornerstone of the city's identity, a testament to its capacity for adaptation and resilience. Ixbal, now an old man, his hands gnarled but still capable of coaxing magic from stone, would sometimes walk the Avenue of the Dead at dusk, watching the shadows lengthen across the Great Pyramids. He would look towards the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, where his carving of the benevolent god stood as a silent sentinel. He had not changed the world overnight, but he had, in his own small way, helped to nudge it towards a slightly gentler path. He had shown his city that the most powerful offerings were not always those born of fear, but those born of love, of hope, and of the enduring human need to create beauty even in the shadow of the gods. And as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, he would offer a quiet prayer of gratitude to Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of both the fearsome strike and the life-giving breath, a deity as complex and paradoxical as the magnificent, mysterious city he called home. The era of Ixbal and the Obsidian prayers, as his and Yaxkin's offerings came to be known, marked a subtle but significant turning point in Teotihuacan's cultural and spiritual trajectory. While the city's fundamental cosmology remained, the belief in a universe sustained by divine energies and reciprocal offerings, the emphasis began to shift. The stark, unyielding demand for blood, though never entirely absent, was increasingly tempered by an appreciation for offerings that symbolized creation, skill, and enduring beauty. Artisan guilds gained even greater prominence. The city's rulers, whether a council or a hidden theocracy, seemed to recognize the power of these guilds not just for producing goods, but for shaping the city's spirit and its reputation abroad. Commissions for grand murals, intricate pottery, and sophisticated obsidian work increased. Teotihuacan became renowned throughout Mesoamerica not only for its immense pyramids and its warrior might, but for the unparalleled artistry that flowed from its workshops. Citlali's narrative weavings became legendary. She developed techniques that blended vibrant dyes with intricate patterns, depicting scenes from Teotihuacan's daily life, its myths, and its renewed connection with the life-giving aspects of nature. Her textiles were sought after by elites within the city and traded far and wide, carrying the story of Teotihuacan's artistic renaissance to distant lands. She established a workshop that trained many young women, passing on her skills and her quiet philosophy of art as a celebration of life. Pentu, in his role as a senior administrator and keeper of records, began to subtly influence the official narratives, while still documenting the necessary state rituals and pronouncements. He also encouraged the recording of significant artistic achievements, of periods of bountiful harvest attributed to renewed piety expressed through both traditional and artistic offerings, and of stories that highlighted the ingenuity and resilience of Teotihuacan's people. He understood that a city's true strength lay not just in its ability to command fear, but in its capacity to inspire hope and cultivate beauty. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, with its dual obsidian icons, Yaxcan's powerful, coiled deity and Ixbal's benevolent, gift-giving creator, became a unique pilgrimage site. Visitors came not just to appease a fearsome god, but to contemplate the complexities of the divine, the interplay of destruction and creation, of power and grace. The priests officiating at the temple began to incorporate interpretations that acknowledged this duality more explicitly in their rites and teachings. Of course, Teotihuacan was not transformed into a utopian paradise. Power struggles still occurred within the ruling elite, though perhaps with less overt reliance on mass public sacrifice to consolidate authority. External threats from rival city-states or migrating groups still necessitated a strong warrior class. Droughts and famines were cyclical threats that even the most fervent artistic offerings could not always avert. But the response to these crises had broadened. When hardship struck, the first recourse was not solely to appease angry gods with blood. There was also a turning towards communal efforts, towards innovations in agriculture or water management inspired, some said, by Quetzalcoatl's aspect as a bringer of knowledge, and towards renewed artistic and spiritual expressions aimed at invoking the benevolent, life-sustaining forces of the cosmos. Ixbal lived to see these changes take root. He saw his apprentices become masters in their own right, carrying forward his legacy of meticulous skill and heartfelt expression. He saw Teotihuacan flourish, its influence spreading not just through trade and political maneuvering, but through the undeniable allure of its art and its evolving spiritual identity. In his final years, Ixbal devoted himself to one last great work, a massive obsidian mural, not for a temple, but for a public plaza near the city's main marketplace. It depicted the cycle of life in the valley of Teotihuacan, the sowing of maize, the gathering of the harvest, families working and celebrating, artisans crafting their wares, children playing under the watchful gaze of the pyramids. And subtly woven into the intricate design were symbols of both Quetzalcoatl's aspects, the serpent of the earth and the underworld, and the plumed bird of the sky and the life-giving winds, coexisting, intertwined, essential to the whole. It was his final prayer in stone, a testament to the beauty and resilience of his city and its people, a quiet assertion that life, in all its forms, was the most sacred offering of all. When it was completed, the people of Teotihuacan marveled at its intricate beauty and its profound, hopeful message. It became a beloved landmark, a place where citizens gathered, where stories were told, where the spirit of the city seemed to reside. When Ixpel finally passed from the world, his spirit joining the ancestors, Teotihuacan mourned him not as a warrior or a priest, but as one of its greatest sons. An artisan whose vision had helped to reshape its soul. His legacy, and that of Yaxkin, was not forgotten. The Obsidian prayers continued to inspire, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power and seemingly immutable tradition, the courage of individuals and the transformative power of art could indeed shift the balance, bringing forth, if not an eternal spring, then at least a longer, more hopeful season for the magnificent, paradoxical city of the gods. The era initiated by Ixpel's offering, often referred to by later Teotihuacan oral traditions as the season of resplendent obsidian, did not last forever. Like all golden ages, it was subject to the inexorable tides of time, environmental change, and human fallibility. Generations after Ixpel, Yaxkin, Sitlali, and Penta had passed into the realm of revered ancestors. New challenges arose that tested the city's evolved spirit. A series of prolonged and exceptionally severe droughts, more devastating than any previously recorded, gripped the Valley of Mexico. The sophisticated irrigation systems, which had been expanded and improved during the more prosperous times, struggled to cope. Famine, a specter long held at bay, began to stalk the city's sprawling apartment compounds. With this desperation came a resurgence of older, harsher religious interpretations. New, more zealous priests emerged, arguing that the city's misfortunes were a direct result of neglecting the ancient, bloodier pacts with the gods. They claimed that Quetzalcoatl, in his more fearsome serpent aspect, felt slighted, his hunger for potent life force offerings unappeased by mere artistry and symbolic gestures. The beautiful obsidian carvings of Ixpel and Yaxkin, once symbols of enlightenment, were now pointed to by some as evidence of the city's hubris, its turning away from the stark necessities of cosmic appeasement. The ruling council, facing widespread unrest and the very real threat of societal collapse, found itself increasingly swayed by these hardline voices. The delicate balance between Quetzalcoatl's creative and destructive aspects, so carefully cultivated in previous generations, began to tilt dangerously. Once again, the great temples called for human hearts. This time, however, the sacrifices were not just of captive warriors from distant lands, but sometimes, chillingly, of Teotihuacan's own citizens, chosen by lot or by accusations of impiety. The city that had once feasted on beauty began to devour itself. The artisan guilds, once so influential, found their status diminished. Their creations, while still valued, were now secondary to the overwhelming demand for offerings that spoke of raw power and submission. The spirit of hope and creative defiance that Ixpel had championed seemed to flicker and wane. Yet, it did not die entirely. Within hidden workshops, in secret gatherings, small groups of artisans and thinkers, inheritors of Ixpel's and Penta's legacy, continued to create art that spoke of life, of connection, of a different kind of divinity. They preserved the stories of the Obsidian prayers, passing them down as forbidden knowledge, a reminder that there had been another way. Sitlali's narrative weavings, carefully hidden, became coded messages of resilience. This internal conflict, this tearing between a desperate reversion to ancient brutality and the flickering embers of a more enlightened spirituality, weakened Teotihuacan from within. The social cohesion that had been one of its greatest strengths began to fracture. The meticulous order of its grid streets and communal compounds masked a growing internal chaos. It was in this period of profound crisis, around 550 CE, that the final, cataclysmic collapse occurred. Whether it was a full-scale internal rebellion by a populace pushed too far, an opportunistic invasion by neighboring groups sensing the city's weakness, or a combination of these factors, remains debated by those who would later sift through its ruins. But the result was undeniable. The great ceremonial centers were burned. Temples, including the once revered Temple of the Feathered Serpent, were desecrated. The workshops of the artisans were ransacked. And the ruling elite, those who had ultimately chosen the path of blood over beauty, vanished, their names and faces unrecorded. Their power extinguished. Teotihuacan, the magnificent city of the gods, the place where Quetzalcoatl had been honored in both obsidian power and obsidian grace, fell silent. Its grand avenues became overgrown, its pyramids weathered monuments to a lost glory. Centuries later, when the Aztecs, new arrivals in the Valley of Mexico, stumbled upon its colossal ruins, they were awestruck. They could not imagine who could have built such a place. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, and incorporated its enigmatic legacy into their own mythology. They revered the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, but their understanding of him was perhaps closer to the more ancient, blood-demanding aspects that had reasserted themselves in Teotihuacan's final, desperate days. Yet, even amidst the ruins, something of Ixbal's spirit, and Yaxcan's, endured. Archaeologists, sifting through the layers of ash and debris, would eventually unearth not only the grand state-sponsored art, but also the hidden caches of personal offerings, the narrative textiles, the tools of artisans who had striven to create beauty. And they would find, within the desecrated temple of the feathered serpent, miraculously preserved in a sealed side chamber, the two obsidian masterpieces, Yaxcan's formidable coiled serpent, and Ixbal's benevolent, gift-giving Quetzalcoatl. They stood side by side, a silent, enduring testament to the city's complex spiritual journey, its moments of brutal sacrifice, and its fleeting, incandescent seasons of resplendent obsidian hope. The city itself had fallen, but the prayers carved in stone, the dreams of its artists, continued to whisper their stories to a distant future. The rediscovery of Teotihuacan's ruins, and particularly the unearthing of the dual obsidian Quetzalcoatl statues from the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, sent ripples through the world of archaeology and art history. The narrative of the city, once primarily focused on its mysterious origins, its immense scale, and its seemingly sudden collapse, gained a new, more nuanced dimension. Scholars and artists, poring over the artifacts and the architectural remnants, began to piece together the story hinted at by the contrasting obsidian figures. They saw evidence of shifting religious emphases, of periods where artistic expression seemed to have been elevated to a form of high spiritual offering, counterbalancing the more brutal sacrificial rites. The oral traditions of later Mesoamerican cultures, which sometimes spoke of a golden age in a mythical ancient city before a time of darkness and decline, were re-examined in this new light. The story of Ixbal of the Rains and Yaxcan the Elder, though their true names were lost to the direct historical record and reconstructed from contextual clues and interpretations of iconography, became a powerful allegory. It represented the eternal tension within civilizations, the struggle between fear-based appeasement of destructive forces and hope-based cultivation of creative, life-affirming energies. Museums around the world vied to display replicas of the two obsidian serpents, often presenting them together to highlight their symbolic dialogue. Art students studied their contrasting styles, Yaxcan's primal power, Ixbal's refined grace. Philosophers and theologians debated the implications of a society that could embrace such seemingly contradictory expressions of the divine. The site of Teotihuacan itself, already a UNESCO World Heritage Site, gained even greater significance. Tourists flocked not just to climb the pyramids of the sun and moon, but to stand before the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, to gaze upon the reconstructed facade with its snarling stone heads, and to imagine the dramas that had unfolded there, the human sacrifices, but also the courageous offerings of artisans who dared to envision a different kind of divinity. Inspired by the story, contemporary Mesoamerican artists began to create new works exploring the dual nature of Quetzalcoatl, and the role of the artist as a spiritual intercessor or a voice of conscience within society. The tale of Ixbal, the young artisan who carved hope from obsidian, resonated deeply, becoming a symbol of indigenous resilience and creative power. Even the city's dramatic collapse, viewed through this new lens, was understood not just as a failure of political or economic systems, but as a tragic consequence of losing a vital spiritual equilibrium, a reversion to fear and internal division when faced with overwhelming environmental and social pressures. The burning of the ceremonial centers, the desecration of temples, seemed like a desperate, self-destructive act by a populace that had lost faith in its rulers and perhaps in its gods, or at least in the way those gods were being interpreted and served. The legacy of Teotihuacan thus became more than just its monumental architecture. It became a profound lesson in the complexities of human belief, the fragility of civilization, and the enduring power of art to reflect, challenge, and sometimes even reshape a society's deepest convictions. The silent, obsidian prayers of Yaxcan and Ixpel, preserved through millennia of dust and oblivion, continue to speak, reminding a modern world that even in the most ancient and enigmatic of cities, the human heart grappled with the same fundamental questions of life, death, creation, and the eternal search for meaning in the face of an often indifferent cosmos. Their story, carved in stone and whispered by the wind sweeping across the avenue of the dead, was a testament to the fact that true power lies not only in the ability to command and destroy, but also in the courage to imagine and create. The ongoing study of Teotihuacan, enriched by the narrative of the Obsidian prayers, began to influence how other ancient civilizations were understood. Archaeologists and historians started looking for similar patterns elsewhere. Evidence of artistic or intellectual movements that might have offered alternative spiritual paths or challenged dominant, often brutal, ideologies. The idea that ancient societies were monolithic in their beliefs was increasingly questioned. In Teotihuacan itself, further excavations around the artisan workshops near the citadel, particularly those specializing in obsidian, revealed more subtle clues. Tools that were finer than strictly necessary for utilitarian or sacrificial blades were unearthed. Fragments of incomplete or practice carvings, showing experimentation with different forms and styles, were found carefully buried, as if hidden or respectfully interred. These findings suggested a thriving, introspective artistic culture, one that valued innovation and personal expression, existing alongside, and sometimes in tension with, the rigid demands of state religion. The figure of Pentu, the wise scribe who recognized and perhaps subtly supported artistic deviation in the story of merit in ancient Egypt, found a parallel in the theoretical patrons or like-minded officials who might have existed in Teotihuacan. Scholars searched for indirect evidence in administrative records, if any were ever deciphered from Teotihuacan's enigmatic script, or in patterns of resource allocation that might suggest support for non-traditional artistic endeavors. Citlali's narrative weavings, though fictional in their specifics as tied to Ixpel, inspired a renewed interest in ancient Mesoamerican textiles. Researchers looked for surviving fragments that might contain complex iconographies beyond the standard religious or elite symbols, searching for voices from the loom that could tell stories of everyday life, of women's perspectives, or of subtle resistance to dominant narratives. The concept of offering beauty instead of blood became a recurring theme in discussions about sustainable cultures and the role of art in societal well-being, far beyond the confines of archaeology. Environmental activists, peace advocates, and proponents of creative education drew inspiration from the Teotihuacan allegory. Even the city's name, the place where gods were born, took on a new layer of meaning. Perhaps it was not just a place where the great deities of the Mesoamerican pantheon were thought to have originated, but also a place where new ideas about divinity, new forms of worship, and new expressions of human spirituality were continually being born, tested, and contested. The city was not static. It was a dynamic crucible of belief. The legend of the rains returning after Ixpel's offering, while understood by modern scholars as likely coincidental, nevertheless highlighted the profound connection ancient peoples felt between their actions, their spiritual observances, and the behavior of the natural world. It underscored their deep dependency on cosmic harmony and their desperate attempts to influence it through every means at their disposal, whether through the shedding of blood or the carving of stone. The final, tragic decline of Teotihuacan, marked by a resurgence of harsher practices and internal strife before its ultimate collapse and abandonment, served as a somber counterpoint to the hope embodied by Ixpel. It was a reminder that even the most profound artistic or spiritual awakenings could be overwhelmed by fear, by environmental catastrophe, or by the reassertion of older, more brutal survival instincts. Civilizations, like individuals, could lose their way, forget their own moments of enlightenment, and succumb to their darker impulses. Yet, the survival of Yaxkin's and Ixpel's obsidian carvings, standing side by side in the ruins, symbolized an enduring truth, that both aspects of existence, the formidable and the gentle, the demanding and the giving, the destructive and the creative, are always present, always in dialogue. The challenge for any society, ancient or modern, was to find the right balance, to nourish the forces of life and hope, without denying the realities of power and struggle. Teotihuacan, through the lens of its obsidian prayers, ceased to be merely a collection of magnificent ruins. It became a timeless story of human aspiration, artistic courage, spiritual searching, and the eternal dance between creation and destruction, a story that continued to resonate with all who sought to understand the depths of the human spirit, and the complex tapestries of civilization. The city of the gods had fallen, but its artists, through their enduring creations, still spoke. The enduring impact of the Obsidian Prayers narrative also began to permeate popular culture in unexpected ways. A renowned composer, captivated by the story, created a symphony titled Teotihuacan, Two Serpents, with movements dedicated to Yaxkin's formidable power and Ixpel's hopeful lyricism. Culminating in a complex, sometimes dissonant, but ultimately transcendent finale representing the city's complex legacy. The symphony was performed in concert halls worldwide, bringing the emotional core of the story to audiences unfamiliar with Mesoamerican archaeology. Graphic novelists and animators were drawn to the visual richness of Teotihuacan and the dramatic potential of Ixpel's and Citlali's struggles. Several acclaimed works emerged, some staying close to the reconstructed historical possibilities, others venturing into more fantastical interpretations, but all capturing the central theme of art as a form of spiritual resistance or alternative offering. These visual retellings made the story accessible to younger generations and those who responded more to imagery than to academic texts. Video game designers even found inspiration in Teotihuacan's unique blend of grand architecture, complex cosmology, and the underlying tension between sacrifice and creation. Games were developed that allowed players to navigate the ancient city, interact with characters like Ixpel or Penta-like figures, and make choices that could influence the city's spiritual path, leading to different outcomes, some mirroring the historical decline, others imagining a more sustained season of resplendent obsidian. The academic world continued its deeper dives. Linguistic anthropologists, though still struggling to fully decipher Teotihuacan's script, looked for subtle shifts in iconographic language on pottery and murals from different periods, searching for visual evidence of the changing religious or philosophical currents that the Obsidian Prayers narrative suggested. Were there periods where symbols of creation, fertility, and artistic endeavor became more prominent than symbols of warfare and sacrifice, the data was complex and often ambiguous. But the quest itself was fueled by the power of the story. The very act of archaeology at Teotihuacan was subtly influenced. Field excavators, when uncovering artisan workshops or residential compounds, began to look with new eyes for evidence of personal, artistic expression, for tools that might have been used for non-utilitarian carvings, for hidden caches of unofficial art. The focus broadened from the monumental and ceremonial to the intimate and personal, recognizing that the true story of a city lies in both its grand pronouncements and its quiet whispers. Moreover, the narrative prompted interdisciplinary collaborations. Archaeologists worked with modern obsidian knappers to better understand the techniques Yaxkin and Ixbel might have used, marveling at the skill required to create such masterpieces with ancient tools. Ethnobotanists studied the psychoactive plants that might have been used by priests and dancers to achieve trance states, trying to understand the experiential reality behind the city's intense religious fervor. The story of Teotihuacan, as enriched by the allegory of its obsidian artists, became a staple in university courses on ancient civilizations, comparative religion, and the sociology of art. It served as a compelling case study of how belief systems shape societies, how art can function as a powerful social and spiritual force, and how even the most imposing empires can be subject to internal ideological shifts and vulnerabilities. Ultimately, the rediscovery and reimagining of this aspect of Teotihuacan's past served as a powerful reminder that history is not a static, finished story, but an ongoing dialogue between the past and the present. The ruins of the city, and the artifacts found within them, were not just dead relics. They were prompts for empathy, for imagination, for a deeper understanding of the enduring human quest for meaning, beauty, and a harmonious relationship with the cosmos. Ixbel's obsidian carving of the gift-giving Quetzalcoatl, standing silently beside Yaxkin's formidable serpent in a museum display case, continued to pose its profound question to all who beheld it: by what offerings shall we live, by blood, or by beauty, by fear, or by hope? The answers, like the city of Teotihuacan itself, remained complex, multifaceted, and eternally relevant. The season of resplendent obsidian, though a relatively brief period in Teotihuacan's long history, left an indelible mark, not just on the archaeological record but on the philosophical understanding of its civilization. It demonstrated that even within a society seemingly defined by rigid cosmic laws and demanding deities, there existed space for human agency, for alternative visions, and for the transformative power of beauty. One of the most significant long-term effects of this reinterpretation was its influence on indigenous communities in modern Mexico and Central America who traced their ancestry back to the great civilizations of the past, including those who had been influenced by Teotihuacan. For generations, their heritage had often been portrayed through a colonial lens that emphasized the more violent aspects of pre-Columbian religions. The story of Ixbel and Yaxkin offered a powerful counter-narrative, one that highlighted artistic genius, spiritual depth, and the courage to challenge oppressive norms from within. Indigenous artists, scholars, and community leaders embraced this aspect of Teotihuacan's legacy. It became a source of pride and inspiration, a reminder that their ancestors were not solely defined by warfare and sacrifice, but also by profound creativity and sophisticated philosophical thought. They saw in Ixbel a figure who embodied indigenous resilience and the enduring importance of art as a means of cultural survival and expression. Obsidian prayer became a metaphor for their own contemporary efforts to revitalize their languages, reclaim their sacred sites, and assert their cultural identity in a modern world. This, in turn, led to a more collaborative approach to archaeology and museum curation. Indigenous representatives increasingly sought, and were granted, a voice in how their ancestral heritage was interpreted and displayed. They advocated for presentations that showcased the full spectrum of pre-Columbian life, including the artistic achievements and the diverse spiritual traditions that went beyond the sensationalized narratives of human sacrifice. The dual Quetzalcoatl statues became potent symbols in these discussions, representing the need for a balanced and nuanced understanding of the past. Furthermore, the story prompted a re-examination of other enigmatic aspects of Teotihuacan, such as its apparent lack of individual ruler iconography, which had long puzzled scholars. Could this anonymity of leadership be connected to periods where a more collective, perhaps council-based governance, allowed for greater diversity of thought and expression, including the kind of artistic and spiritual innovation represented by Ixbel? While purely speculative, such questions opened up new avenues for research and challenged older assumptions about centralized Autocratic rule. The environmental aspects of Teotihuacan's story also gained prominence. The devastating drought that preceded the city's final decline, and the earlier drought that had been broken by the rains, following Ixbal's offering, highlighted the critical dependence of even great civilizations on ecological stability. This resonated strongly in an era of modern climate change, making Teotihuacan's fate a cautionary tale about the consequences of environmental stress and the societal responses, both constructive and destructive, that such crises can provoke. The idea of offering beauty was sometimes reinterpreted in an ecological context as a call for actions that restore and honor the natural world, rather than merely exploiting it or trying to appease its destructive forces through desperate measures. Even the character of Tlacanol, the cynical but supportive potter friend of Ixbal, found a place in the expanded narrative. He came to represent the voice of the common person, the observer who sees the follies of the powerful but also recognizes the courage of individuals. His pragmatism and his enduring friendship with Ixbal provided a grounding counterpoint to the more epic, spiritual dimensions of the story. Ultimately, Teotihuacan, through the lens of its Obsidian prayers, became less of a remote, alien civilization and more of a mirror reflecting timeless human struggles and aspirations. Its grand pyramid still spoke of immense power and cosmic ambition. But its more intimate artistic expressions, championed by figures like Ixbal, spoke of the enduring human need for hope, beauty, and a world where creation could triumph over destruction. The city's fall was a tragedy, but the survival of its art, and the stories it inspired, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a whisper of Obsidian hope carried across the centuries. The legacy of Teotihuacan, as re-envisioned through the narrative of Ixbal and the Obsidian prayers, continued to inspire creative and scholarly endeavors that sought to bridge the gap between the ancient past and contemporary concerns. One such initiative was the Teotihuacan Resilience Project, an interdisciplinary effort that brought together archaeologists, artists, climate scientists, and indigenous community leaders. Their goal was to study not just the city's collapse, but also its periods of flourishing and adaptation, drawing lessons from modern societies facing their own complex challenges. Ixbal's story became a central metaphor for this project. His act of offering an artistic vision in a time of crisis was seen as a model for creative problem-solving and the courage to propose alternative solutions when traditional methods failed. The project sponsored workshops where contemporary artisans worked with obsidian and other traditional materials, not just to replicate ancient techniques, but to create new works that addressed modern themes of environmental sustainability, social justice, and spiritual well-being, inspired by Teotihuacan's complex heritage. Citlali's narrative weavings, though largely a product of the expanded legend, also sparked a revival of interest in traditional Mesoamerican textile arts. Weavers' cooperatives were formed, drawing inspiration from ancient patterns and iconographies, but infusing them with contemporary stories and concerns. These textiles became a vibrant form of cultural expression and economic empowerment for many indigenous women. The figure of Pentu, the wise Teotihuacano scribe, a composite character blending elements from different narratives, including the Egyptian one, also found a place in this modern reinterpretation. He symbolized the importance of alliedship, those within established power structures who recognize and support transformative voices from the margins. His role in preserving and validating alternative narratives was seen as crucial. This inspired discussions about the responsibility of modern institutions, museums, universities, governments, to actively seek out, preserve, and promote diverse and often overlooked histories and artistic expressions. Even the darker aspects of Teotihuacan's story, the resurgence of mass human sacrifice during its decline, the internal strife, and the eventual violent collapse, served as potent reminders. They highlighted the fragility of even the most sophisticated civilizations, the dangers of succumbing to fear and dogma in times of crisis, and the catastrophic consequences of abandoning principles of hope and creative adaptation. The burned temples and desecrated workshops stood as silent warnings. The Obsidian prayers themselves, Yaxkin's powerful serpent and Ixbal's benevolent creator god, continued to be objects of intense study and contemplation. Art conservators used cutting-edge techniques to analyze their composition. The tool marks, the subtle choices made by their creators, revealing ever more about the sophisticated craftsmanship and artistic vision of Teotihuacan's artisans. Philosophers wrote extensively about their symbolic dialogue, seeing in them a representation of the fundamental dualities that underpin human existence and the cosmos itself. The story of Teotihuacan, thus enriched, moved beyond the confines of academic journals and museum halls. It became a living narrative, continually reinterpreted and reapplied to new contexts. It reminded people that the past is not merely a collection of facts and artifacts, but a source of enduring wisdom, cautionary tales, and profound inspiration. The city of the gods, though long silent, still had much to teach those who were willing to listen to its stones. Its art, and the resonant echoes of its obsidian prayers. Its ultimate legacy was not one of conquest or empire, but of an unyielding human quest to find meaning, create beauty, and strive for balance in a world of formidable powers and unpredictable fates. The spirits of Ixbal, Yaxkin, Sidlali, and Pentu, whether historical figures or potent archetypes, lived on, not just in the ruins of their magnificent city, but in the hearts and minds of all who sought to build a more hopeful, creative, and resilient future. As the narrative of Ixbal and the Obsidian prayers became more deeply woven into the global understanding of Teotihuacan, it began to influence educational curricula in profound ways. Children were introduced to the story not just as a piece of ancient history, but as a tale of courage, creativity, and the power of individuals to make a difference. Even within seemingly rigid and overwhelming systems, the contrast between the brutal demands of traditional sacrifice and the innovative offering of art provided a rich basis for discussions about ethics, leadership, and societal change. University courses on art history, religious studies, and even political science incorporated Teotihuacan as a case study in how artistic and spiritual movements can interact with, and sometimes challenge, state power. The city's periods of flourishing, attributed in part to the season of resplendent obsidian, were analyzed for insights into how cultural vibrancy and a more flexible spiritual outlook might contribute to social cohesion and resilience. Conversely, its decline was studied as an example of how a regression towards fear-based ideologies and internal suppression can lead to societal breakdown. The character of Ixbal, in particular, became an archetype of the artist as social innovator. His willingness to risk everything to offer a different vision, a prayer in stone that spoke of hope and creation rather than solely of appeasement through destruction, resonated deeply with contemporary movements focused on positive change. His story was invoked by activists, environmentalists, and proponents of non-violent resistance, who saw in his actions a timeless example of using creative means to challenge entrenched power structures and advocate for a more life-affirming worldview. Museums exhibiting Teotihuacano artifacts began to design their displays with this enriched narrative in mind. Instead of focusing solely on the monumental scale of the pyramids or the macabre details of sacrificial rituals, they curated sections that highlighted the city's artistic achievements, the sophistication of its craft guilds, and the possible philosophical currents suggested by works like Ixbal's benevolent Quetzalcoatl. Interactive exhibits allowed visitors to explore the techniques of obsidian carving or textile weaving, fostering a deeper appreciation for the skill and dedication of Teotihuacan's artisans. The impact was also felt in the field of historical fiction and speculative storytelling. Writers and filmmakers, inspired by the core legend, created new narratives set in Teotihuacan, exploring the lives of other artisans, priests, or common citizens who might have grappled with the city's complex spiritual demands. These works, while often fictionalized, helped to humanize the ancient city, making its inhabitants relatable and their struggles understandable to modern audiences. One particularly influential project was a large-scale, collaborative mural painted in a major Latin American city, depicting scenes from Teotihuacan's history, with the Obsidian prayers as its central motif. The mural became a public art landmark, sparking conversations about cultural heritage, artistic freedom, and the ongoing relevance of ancient wisdom in addressing contemporary challenges. Even the tourism industry adapted. Guided tours of Teotihuacan began to include not just the facts about the pyramids and their astronomical alignments, but also the stories of Yaxcan and Ixpel, inviting visitors to reflect on the deeper spiritual and artistic currents that had shaped the city. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent. With its reconstructed facade and the imagined presence of the dual obsidian offerings within, became a focal point for these more contemplative tours. The legacy of Teotihuacan, therefore, continued to grow and evolve, proving that a civilization's true immortality lies not just in its physical monuments, but in the enduring power of its stories, its art, and the human spirit that animated them. The whispers from the Avenue of the Dead, carried on the wind and amplified by the resonant tale of the Obsidian artists, spoke of a city that, for all its enigmatic grandeur and moments of brutal sacrifice, had also touched upon a profound truth, that the highest form of prayer, the most potent offering to the cosmos, might indeed be the courageous act of creating beauty and affirming life in the very face of the void. And in that, Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, became a timeless beacon for all humanity. The narrative of the Obsidian prayers eventually circled back to influence the very land from which it sprang, Teotihuacan itself. The Mexican government, in collaboration with international cultural organizations and indigenous community representatives, initiated a new phase of preservation and presentation at the archaeological site. This phase was guided by a desire to reflect the more nuanced understanding of the city's history that had emerged. A new museum wing was planned, dedicated specifically to the artistic achievements of Teotihuacan, with a central exhibit focused on the story of Yaxcan and Ixpel and the significance of their obsidian offerings. Replicas of their imagined masterpieces would be displayed, alongside genuine artifacts from artisan workshops, tools, and examples of everyday art found on pottery and murals. The exhibit would aim to immerse visitors in the world of Teotihuacan's creators, highlighting their skill, their spiritual beliefs, and their potential role in shaping the city's destiny. Furthermore, educational programs were developed for local schools and visiting student groups, focusing not just on the monumental architecture, but on the human stories behind the stones. Children were encouraged to engage in their own artistic interpretations of Teotihuacan's myths and daily life, fostering a connection with their heritage that went beyond rote memorization of facts. Workshops in traditional crafts, including obsidian carving using safe, modern techniques and weaving, were offered, linking the ancient skills with contemporary artistic expression. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, while its original obsidian masterpieces were housed in museums for preservation, saw the installation of high-quality, exact replicas in their conjectured original positions within a protected area of the temple. This allowed visitors to experience the intended visual and symbolic impact of the dual offerings, the formidable power of the coiled serpent and the benevolent grace of the gift-giving creator, in their sacred context. Accompanying interpretive panels told the story of the Obsidian prayers, inviting reflection on the city's complex spiritual journey. This renewed focus on the artistic and humanistic aspects of Teotihuacan also had an economic impact. Local artisan communities around the site experienced a resurgence. As demand grew for high-quality crafts inspired by the city's rich heritage, tourists were eager to purchase items that reflected not just the grandeur of the pyramids, but also the intimate artistry of figures like Ixpel and Citlali. This provided sustainable livelihoods for many families and helped to keep traditional craft skills alive. The story also found its way into contemporary spiritual discussions. For some, Teotihuacan, as interpreted through the lens of the Obsidian prayers, became a symbol of a more balanced, holistic approach to spirituality, one that acknowledged the necessary interplay of light and shadow, creation and destruction, but ultimately affirmed the power of hope, beauty, and compassionate action. Retreats and workshops were even held near the ancient city, drawing on its energy and its legends to inspire personal growth and creative expression. The ultimate irony, perhaps, was that a narrative largely reconstructed from archaeological interpretation, allegory, and inspired fiction had taken on a life of its own, becoming a powerful force for reinterpreting and re-engaging with a genuine historical site. It demonstrated that our understanding of the past is never static. It is constantly being reshaped by new discoveries, new perspectives, and the enduring human need to find meaning and connection in the stories of those who came before us. Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, continued to guard its deepest secrets. The names of its rulers, the precise nature of its governance, the full meaning of its enigmatic script, these might remain forever elusive. But through the enduring tale of its obsidian artists, it offered a profound and timeless message, that within every civilization, within every human heart, lies the capacity for both immense cruelty and breathtaking beauty, for blind adherence to dogma and courageous leaps of creative faith. And the choices made between these poles, whether by individuals or by entire societies, are what ultimately shape destiny and define legacy. The whispers from the Avenue of the Dead had found their voice, and it was a voice that spoke, above all, of the resilient, creative, and endlessly searching spirit of humanity. As Teotihuacan's revitalized narrative spread, it even began to influence fields seemingly distant from archaeology and art history, such as urban planning and community development. The city's original meticulous grid layout, its communal apartment compounds designed for extended families, and its sophisticated water management systems had always been subjects of study. But now, these were viewed through the additional lens of the Obsidian prayers. How might a city's physical design support or hinder a culture of creativity, spiritual balance, and resilience? Urban planners looked at Teotihuacan's integration of grand ceremonial spaces with densely populated residential areas and vibrant marketplaces, considering how modern cities could better foster a sense of community, shared purpose, and access to both sacred/contemplative spaces and centers of bustling economic and artistic activity. The idea that a city's soul is reflected not just in its monumental structures but in the quality of life and the opportunities for expression available to all its citizens gained traction. The story of Ixbal, in particular, resonated with those working in education and youth empowerment. His journey from a skilled but constrained artisan to a courageous visionary who challenged the status quo through his art became a powerful example for young people facing their own societal pressures or limitations. Programs were developed that used storytelling, art, and craft to help youth find their voices, express their perspectives, and imagine alternative futures for their communities, drawing direct inspiration from Ixbal's reconstructed actions. Even in the realm of conflict resolution and peacebuilding, the allegory of Teotihuacan offered insights. The city's tragic decline, attributed in part to a resurgence of fear-based sacrificial ideologies and internal division, served as a cautionary tale. Conversely, the season of resplendent Obsidian, with its emphasis on dialogue, creative offerings, and a more inclusive spiritual vision, was seen as a model for how societies might navigate crises through means other than violence and suppression. The dual Quetzalcoatl statues became symbols of the need to embrace complexity and find common ground between seemingly opposing forces. The scientific community, too, found continued inspiration. The fictionalized but potent detail of the celestial pigment in the earlier Merit story from Egypt, when cross-pollinated with the Teotihuacan narrative, spurred real-world archaeoastronomers and materials scientists to look more closely at pigments and materials used in ancient Mesoamerican art. Were there other instances of unusual or symbolic materials being incorporated into sacred objects. What could these tell us about ancient understandings of the cosmos and the perceived connections between the earthly and celestial realms? Thus, Teotihuacan, filtered through the imaginative reconstruction of its artistic and spiritual struggles, became more than just an ancient ruin or a historical puzzle. It transformed into a dynamic source of ongoing dialogue, reflection, and inspiration across a multitude of disciplines and cultural contexts. Its story was no longer confined to the past. It was actively shaping conversations about the present and the future. The legacy of Yaxkin and Ixpel, whether as precise historical figures or as potent archetypes, demonstrated that the prayers offered by a civilization need not always be literal supplications or bloody sacrifices. They could also be the dedicated work of hands, the courageous expression of a new vision, the collective commitment to fostering beauty, wisdom, and life-affirming values. These, too, were powerful offerings to the cosmos, capable of shaping a city's soul and echoing through the ages. Teotihuacan, in its rise, its moments of enlightened creativity, its tragic fall, and its enduring artistic remnants, offered a profound and multifaceted testament to this enduring truth. The city built by giants and dreamed by gods continued to speak, and the world, in new and diverse ways, continued to listen. The final resonance of Teotihuacan's obsidian prayers was perhaps most keenly felt in the quiet, individual contemplation of those who visited the ancient city or encountered its story. Beyond the grand theories and the interdisciplinary projects, the tale of Ixpel, Yaxkin, and Sitlali touched upon fundamental human experiences, the love between siblings, the respect for a mentor, the courage to stand against injustice, the fear of loss, and the profound solace found in creative expression. People walked the vast avenue of the dead, no longer just as tourists admiring ancient stonework, but as pilgrims on a journey of reflection. They stood before the reconstructed facade of the Temple of the Feathered Serpent and tried to imagine the scene, the young artisan Ixpel, his heart pounding, holding aloft his obsidian carving of a benevolent god, challenging centuries of tradition in a desperate plea for hope and life. They felt a connection. A sense of shared humanity that transcended the vast gulf of time and culture. The story prompted questions: what are the sacrifices demanded by our own societies, our own belief systems? What are the obsidian prayers we might offer in response? What forms of beauty, creativity, or courageous truth-telling can we bring forth to counter fear, division, or despair? For many, Teotihuacan ceased to be just an archaeological marvel and became a spiritual touchstone. Its ruins were not merely remnants of a dead civilization, but a landscape imbued with the echoes of profound human drama, of choices made between fear and hope, destruction and creation. The wind that whispered through its plazas seemed to carry the murmur of ancient chants, the chip-chip-chip of obsidian tools, and the silent, powerful language of art. The city's ultimate mystery, who its rulers were, what their names were, the precise details of their governance and their final downfall, remained. But perhaps this very anonymity was part of its enduring power. It allowed Teotihuacan to become a story not about specific kings or dynasties, but about broader human themes, about the collective spirit of a people, about the archetypal struggles and aspirations that define the human condition. In this sense, Ixpel was not just an ancient artisan. He was every individual who has ever dared to create, to challenge, to dream of a better way. Sitlali was not just a ceremonial dancer. She was every beloved for whom one would risk everything. Yaxkin was not just a master craftsman. He was every mentor who inspires courage and passes on wisdom. And Pentu in his Teotihuacano analog was every quiet ally who uses their position to nurture and protect fragile sparks of innovation. The obsidian prayers of Teotihuacan, whether understood as historical reconstruction, allegorical legend, or a fusion of both, had achieved what all great art aspires to. They had transcended their original context to speak to universal human truths. They reminded a world often fractured by conflict and consumed by fleeting concerns that the quest for beauty, Meaning, and a harmonious existence is an ancient and enduring one, a prayer carved not just in stone, but in the very fabric of the human soul. And so, the city of Teotihuacan, once the magnificent heart of a powerful Mesoamerican civilization, then a silent ruin holding its secrets for centuries, found a new life, a new voice, in the stories it inspired. Its pyramids still pointed to the heavens, its avenue of the dead still stretched towards the horizon, but now they were imbued with a deeper, more human resonance, a testament to the Obsidian artists who had dared to offer prayers of hope and creation to their complex, demanding, and ultimately unforgettable gods. The echoes of their courage, and their art, continued to shape the understanding of all who encountered their enduring legacy. 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 Of